Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sinoland in Shenzhen, just south of the Tropic of Cancer. And today's podcast is a little bit longer than some of the ones that have been done recently. The title is China, Thailand, Cambodia, and the Philippines Say F-U to Western Colonialism. It is October 19th. There's a ton of links in this thing and several photos. So if you can get to the original article and read along while I do this, it would be more meaningful. The article's photo shows a bloodbath, lots of dead bodies, and the byline says, "Another day in empire. Another trophy shot of all the dark-skinned natives slaughtered." Pictured above are U.S. soldiers proudly showing off the hundreds of Filipinos massacred at Bud Dajo on March 7, 1906. To bring the people of the Philippines to their knees, Uncle Sam exterminated over 1 million locals via massacres, forced famines, and the genocidal destruction of villages, towns, dams, irrigation systems, and crops. Socialist Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte had the courage to hold this photo up at the big 2016 ASEAN summit while presenting at the podium. In his last State of the Nation address, Duterte demanded that the United States return church bells that were stolen after the 1901 Balajiga genocide, where Americans slaughtered 50,000 locals over the age of 10. Imperial client state leaders are supposed to know their place as racial inferiors. Talk about speaking truth to naked power. Thank you, Mr. Duterte. Here is the article. Let me take a sip of my pu'er tea. When we were children, we all loved to pretend, didn't we? So, let's play make-believe in bold italics below. And here it is. Imagine an endless series of meetings in Beijing and other cities around China. At these meetings are guests. These guests are citizens from Land, that being North America, NATO, the European Union, Australia, and New Zealand. They are not your average tourists or business people. These Westerners are on a mission, and Baba Beijing, China's leadership, is there to guide them. These Westerners are the cream of the crop. They graduated from Land's top universities, Yale, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, ENA, École Polytechnique, etc. For years, starting at university, China's spy agency began to carefully cultivate them as subversive agents to promote China's political system of communism and socialism in the West. Baba Beijing's goal since 1949 has been and continues to be spending billions and investing limitless hours and effort to overthrow capitalism in Land and undermine Westerners' way of life. To convert them to socialism with Chinese characteristics so that Baba Beijing can ruthlessly extract the West's natural resources and exploit its people, quote, legally, end of quote. China does this via global financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, as well as China's global corporations that work on every continent. And it goes without saying that there is always China's much feared and reviled People's Liberation Army, which has an occupying presence in almost every country on earth. These young Western stars are promoted by the Chinese in the mainstream media as good and righteous citizens whose principles of socialist fairness, friendship, solidarity, democracy, equality, and the rule of law are in the best interests of the West. After they graduate, these Chinese agents are feted, wined, dined, and flown back and forth between China and their home countries, all thanks to Baba Beijing's largesse. They are showered with Chinese money to burn, to manage so-called non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and foundations, run for political office, worming their way into positions of policy making and legislation, or working in the media, military, and churches to help Baba Beijing achieve its never-ending pursuit of full-spectrum global dominance and control. These Chinese NGOs and foundations are thinly veiled vehicles of sabotage and destabilization managed and manipulated by Baba Beijing to fulfill its goal of overturning the West's economic and social systems. There are, in fact, thousands of these Chinese-backed NGOs and foundations all over Uranglo land, hiring many thousands of local Westerners. Most of these hirelings are clueless and just need a job, coming from armies of unemployed who are just happy to get paid 20 to 30 euros a day. They serve the Chinese cause in many ways. They do phone and street surveys. On social media like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, they post poisonous propaganda and lies to destroy the West's image around the world. These days it is called, quote, fake news, end of quote. For the more physical-minded, they participate in astroturf movements to promote the Chinese way of life and counter-protest against pro-Western groups, or they just hit the streets to protest against Western institutions. For all this phony street-level destabilization, their Chinese handlers will often instruct them to attack other citizens and destroy property, to create violent, chaotic scenes for the managed and manipulated mainstream media to use to saturate the 24-hour news cycle. This is especially effective when they pretend to be pro-Western groups to make the Western establishment look out of control. Moving on up the sabotage chain of regime change, these NGOs can also provide the crisis actors needed for false flag, quote, terrorist, end of quote, attacks, to fill Westerners with fear and insecurity, so much so that they will one day beg for the Chinese to move in and save them, or accept a Chinese-controlled, white-faced fascist junta to guarantee public security and safety. Even the local NGO bosses mostly think they are doing, quote, good work, end of quote, that is best for their country's interest. But their Chinese minders and manipulators who are doling out the cash and keeping them on message with Chinese socialism is the only way have much more ambitious goals and objectives. Since 1949, this model of regime change has worked incredibly well in most of the countries around the world because they are too weak to fight back against China's ability to print unlimited quantities of money to spend on its hegemonic global objectives of extraction and exploitation. And when the penetration, sabotage, overthrow model doesn't work, the Chinese always have their military to count on across the planet. The PLA works closely with China's spy agency and their NGOs to create one false flag after another. Then the prostituted mainstream media works 24/7 to brainwash the people about the need to justify invasion, occupation, and war. End of make-believe session. If this make-believe story looks vaguely familiar to current events, you would be right. Just replace the words China, Chinese, Baba Beijing, and Baba Beijing with the West, Westerners, and Washington, London, Paris, and that is the world we live in, sorry to say. It has been this way since at least the end of World War II. One could soundly argue that it has been true as far back as the 15th century, when Europe's marauding pirates began devouring the planet like locusts and continue to do so to this day. But much has changed in the last 75 or 500 years, depending on your choice of historical signpost. The West's ability to impose its dictatorial suzerainty on the world's non-white-skinned peoples is not what it used to be. 4 of the most resource-rich countries in the world are free from Western control: China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. One could argue that this trend in wresting free from imperial tyranny started with China's liberation in 1949, Iran's independence after its socialist Islamic revolution in 1979 was another devastating blow to Western colonialism. Russia's jaw-dropping rise from the ashes of 1990s Western disaster capitalism was and is as momentous as China's 1949 liberation. And socialist Venezuela is keeping up the good fight against the West's relentless assault on the Bolivarian revolution's fiercely proud anti-imperial way of life. Uncle Sam does not hesitate to use regional whore states like Colombia as a conduit for sabotage. This momentum is gaining speed in Asia, thanks in large part to one of the most important and underappreciated world leaders today, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. His socialist anti-Western platform is emboldening other leaders around the planet to resist empire's tyranny. What is so refreshing to the rest of the world is Duterte's willingness to shout out what Western colonialism is truly based on: racism and genocide. And Roddy, as he is called, R-O-D-D-Y, just keeps on punching Urangulaland's face, exposing blatant regime change efforts in his beloved 7,500 island archipelago, exactly like the all-too-real make-believe scenario above. Duterte rightfully keeps calling Westerners sons of bitches, and deservedly so. Go, Roddy, go! Cambodia's leaders are also sick and tired of the West's incessant attempts to overthrow that country's way of life, which is closely aligned with China. Again, referring to the make-believe story above, the government recently arrested a national politician for treason for being a blatant American agent and an enemy of the people. Delicious revenge for France's and America's massacre of millions in Cambodia during a century of colonialism and war. Hang him high, Cambodia. In neighboring Thailand, egregious Western sabotage, organized by traitorous local politicians, forced members of the military, loyal to the citizens and the royal family, to take over the reins of government since the country's, quote, democratic, end of quote, system has been for years subverted by Uncle Sam and company. The military leadership is also heavily leaning towards Baba Beijing, which infuriates the West. I never loved a room full of high-minded principled generals so much in my life. Unfortunately, in Myanmar, also known formerly as Burma, the West's model of sabotage and chaos is working as planned. Its Nobel, quote, peace, end of quote, prize finger puppet, Madame Suu Kyi, is the perfect photogenic ventriloquist dummy for Washington, London, and Paris. She should be arrested and hanged for treason and shot for working with the West to cause the Rohingya genocide. All of this brings us to Hong Kong and China, the big kahuna on the Asian and world stage. Like the U.S. using bootlicking Colombia to try to destroy socialist Venezuela, the same imperial game plan is being used in Hong Kong to try to bring down the Chinese Communist Party, abbreviated CPC. Since as early as 1947, when the West knew the Communists were destined to beat the Japanese and run the fascist KMT and Western colonialists out of the country, Urangulaland began to try to destroy Mao Zedong's Red Rise. First, Empire tried to split off Tibet, and up to today, that has been a complete failure. Then Taiwan was and is being used to try to cause the Chinese people grief. This, too, has been another goose egg for the hapless West. Then the world witnessed the West's horrific genocides in Korea and Vietnam, and again, nothing but humiliation for the white-skinned team, and still true today. The West helped divide Russia and China in 1960 and did a great job keeping them hostile to each other. But that all ended with Putin leading Team R, President Vladimir Putin, leading Team R, the Bears, in 2000. About 10 years ago, Uncle Sam and his genocidal gangsters then put all their resources and money into Xinjiang, the largely Muslim Chinese province that borders several key geopolitical stands, as they're called, like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, etc. Again, other than a few low-impact terrorist acts pulled off in country, the West's Libya-Syria model of destruction and genocide in China has landed on its face. I wrote very informative chapters in China Rising, Capitalist Roads, Socialist Destinations, and the next book, China is Communist, Damn It, Dawn of the Red Dynasty, about the history of Hong Kong and its association with the West. When European pirates first landed nearby in 1517, with a priest on board, of course. It has been all downhill since, including the West turning Hong Kong into the illegal drug capital of the world, opium and morphine, reaping obscene profits from humanity's longest-running and most profitable organized crime cartel in human history. That money built cities like Boston and made many families like the Roosevelts very, very rich. Capitalism at its best or worst, depending on your point of view. This all ended thanks to Mao Zedong and the communists wiping out drug addiction among around 100 million users within 2 years after kicking out the capitalists and fascists in 1949. With all these embarrassing failures to destroy the CPC via Tibet, Taiwan, Korea, Vietnam, Russia, and Xinjiang, Urangla Land's imperial psychopaths turned their mayhem on Hong Kong. It too has been a total failure, but Baba Beijing means to honor its commitment to the basic laws, two systems, one country ideals, and try to play by the West's rules. Thus, this leaves empire a critically soft underbelly to try to subvert the mainland. This started in earnest in 2014 with the phony U.S.-backed Occupy Central and Umbrella Revolution, so-called protests. The efforts to bring down the CPC via Hong Kong have not stopped since. Just this week, a CIA MI6 type, Mr. Benedict Rogers, came to Hong Kong town under the guise of a phony NGO to, quote, protect Hong Kong's democracy and freedom, end of quote. Baba Beijing picked up the phone and called the gang in blue at the airport, which, according to the basic law that Frau Margaret Thatcher signed, is perfectly within its right. This Benedict Arnold saboteur wasn't even allowed out of transit and was sent back home with his seditious tail between his legs. Good riddance, asshole. And there's a photo of Benedict Rogers and a group of Hong Kongers in London. The byline says, MI6 NGO asset Benedict Rogers, third from the right, meeting with Hong Kong subversives in London. The 5 guys carrying Hong Kong passports should be tried and shot for treason. Smile, boys. You should hang your heads in shame. In the meantime, Chinese security has apparently picked up intelligence that some bad actors are trying to cross the Shenzhen-Hong Kong border, where I live, via private taxi services, coming and going. Starting this week, passengers will now be required to get out of the car for a more detailed look-see in the car inspected by border police. So, boys and girls, I know it's hard to accept, and the denial card plays large in your hands. But this is what Westerners do 24/7, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, non-stop. Capitalists and imperialists, who are essentially the same animal, have saurian brains and think and act like Komodo dragons. They foul up their environment and slaughter everything moving so their greedy little paws can steal all your money and resources. Whether you live or die is of no consequence to them, be you Chinese or Westerner. And then there's a lovely photograph of a Komodo dragon wolfing down a huge chunk of raw meat. And the byline says, an imperialist capitalist gorging itself on the weak and powerless. More and more people around the world are refusing to be their food. And in closing, there's a note at the end. The South China Morning Post has done a good job covering the Benedict Rogers farce. Be sure to watch the short video clips embedded in the articles. They do a nice job of explaining the 1997 Basic Law and mainland China's rights and responsibilities within the framework. All right, everybody. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend coming up. And please share this liberally on your social media and spread the word. There is a lot of fake news out there. And on China Rising Radio Sinoland, you have an opportunity to learn how the world really works. And it will help you understand where you are headed into the 21st century. Thank you and have a wonderful day.